In 15 years of taking care of soldiers, I have never seen the litany of debilitating and potentially deadly medical conditions that included strokes, transient ischemic attacks, pericarditis, myocarditis, erratic heart rates, arrhythmias, rapid onset and progression of various cancers to include testicular cancer, esophageal cancer, brain tumors, neuroendocrine tumors, thyroid dysfunction, multiple sclerosis, cognitive impairment, persistent severe insomnia, suppression of the immune system, unprovoked clots in the splenic and portal vein, liver dysfunction, menstrual irregularities, and miscarriages. This cluster of medical conditions represented a dramatic shift in the acuity of medical conditions normally seen in this population. In the absence of transparency and a functioning medical surveillance system, I believe the information and expertise I gained from having access to the uncensored C19 group, my firsthand experience monitoring the health of my brigade, and the data from the Defense Medical Epidemiology Database uniquely have equipped me with invaluable insight into the emerging deleterious effects of the COVID vaccine on aviation safety. The DMED database is a database in which military healthcare professionals can perform queries to determine medical trends among active duty personnel using International Codes of Disease, ICD codes. Since the DoD uses one electronic medical record system worldwide, the DMED is arguably one of the most accurate epidemiology databases in the United States. For example, I could query how many times healthcare providers across the DoD had diagnosed an active duty service member with ICD I-26 pulmonary embolisms, going all the way back to 1991. As you can see, these are cases of diagnoses of pulmonary embolisms that healthcare providers in the military have made across the DoD in years 2016 through 2021. I was unable to get transparency from senior medical leaders on vaccine adverse events, so I began looking up ICD codes in the DMED that corresponded to rare medical conditions I was seeing in my population. Here are some more of the DMED findings. You heard Rosie talk about her thyroid autoimmune disorder. Pregnancy with abortive outcome. Congenital malformations of babies. Cancer of the breast. When you took the DMED data and you overlaid various reports on service members, you see that the curves correlate perfectly. Here is 2 out of the 9 pages outlined in the 1,291 adverse events. All the conditions in blue are incompatible with safety of flight. All of the highlighted conditions in yellow are conditions I have personally seen. In the FDA's October 22, 2020 presentation regarding safety surveillance of COVID-19 vaccines proves the FDA was aware of these vaccines were dangerous and deadly. This list of devastating cardiovascular, neurologic, autoimmune, pregnancy, and reproductive complications should have been unacceptable not only in Army aviation, but also for military leaders across the DoD, physicians across the country, and regulatory agencies like the FDA. My father's passion in life was studying health science and helping people. My father did not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine, but after relentless threats of further isolation and fear, he took the vaccine. Several months ago, we found out my father had widespread metastatic cancer and was terminal. My father spent the majority of the next 11 weeks after his diagnosis in isolation from friends and family by draconian COVID quarantine policies. It took heroic efforts by my sister to get my father out of the hospital and back to Minnesota, where he could spend his final days around loved ones. Just days before my father passed, my religious accommodation request was denied by the same service I had served faithfully for over 30 years. My father died knowing that my faith was not valued. How many people here in Alaska can relate to this form of for your own good healthcare? Fellowship is the lifeblood of our health. Involuntary isolation used to be called imprisonment. Now it's been rebranded as, quote, the new healthcare. My father understood the peril that we faced in this battle, but more importantly, he understood the power of faith and prayer. In what would be one of our last conversations, he told me, "Theresa, love your enemies. Pray for those that persecute you. Take care of your men and women. And in all things, praise God." Of course, I have a heart for Alaska. I'm an aerospace medicine doctor, and aviation is the lifeline for hundreds of thousands of Alaskans, and perhaps the only true way to appreciate the magnitude of Alaska's beauty. I served in the enlisted and officer ranks in the U.S. Army since 1991. The Army has trained me as an expert in aerospace and occupational medicine. My testimony here today is based on my firsthand medical training, my background in public health, epidemiology research, and as a flight surgeon. Senator, I have grave concerns about the health and safety of our servicemen and women. Today, I'm going to cover 6 areas regarding how the vaccine mandate has impacted the health and safety of our servicemen, degrading our national security. Back in September 2021, I submitted an affidavit in the Robert V. Austin case in which I outlined how the DoD was violating its own risk management process in their push to mandate the vaccination of every member of the armed forces with an experimental vaccine. After my testimony was made public, the DoD made no effort to investigate my safety concerns. On November 4th, 2021, I was called to testify before the permanent ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations, Senator Ron Johnson. In that testimony, I reported that in one day I had to ground 3 out of 3 pilots for vaccine injuries. One of those pilots I spoke of was a college athlete prior to being selected for flight training. Just 12 days prior to completing his training as an Apache pilot, I saw him for chest pain after vaccination. I subsequently diagnosed him with myocarditis, or inflammation of the heart, that left him with permanent scarring of the muscle, so significant that it increased his risk of sudden cardiac death at the age of 24. I filed a VAERS report on him like I have many other vaccine-injured pilots. The cardiac damage was not compatible with continued flight status, nor was it compatible with continued military service. Months after the soldier left Fort Rucker, I called him to check on him. I reviewed his medical records only to discover that his immunization record had been altered to make it look as though he had been vaccinated after he developed myocarditis. A review of records started to reveal a pattern of alterations in vaccine records, several of which were previously submitted VAERS reports. Falsification of medical records is a crime. In 2021, after reviewing cases of 2 service members with pituitary brain tumors, I searched for answers to determine if there was a pathophysiologic basis that this new messenger RNA technology could cause brain tumors. I engaged the C19 group. This was a group of over 450 doctors, scientists, mathematicians, and Nobel laureates from around the world who were looking at early outpatient treatment options for SARS-CoV-2 and vaccine safety. The answer to my question came right from research from Pfizer that demonstrated that the spike protein is the pathogenic portion of the coronavirus meaning it causes blood vessel dysfunction leading to microclots, and it also suppresses the tumor suppressor gene that prevents cancer. Then experts pointed me to Pfizer's own biodistribution study. The biodistribution study tells you where in the body the drug goes and how much of it concentrates in each organs. I reviewed Pfizer's biodistribution study that proved not only that the messenger RNA COVID vaccine did not stay locally in the muscle after injection, as we were told, but in fact concentrated in the pituitary of the brain, the spinal cord, lung, liver, adrenal glands, ovaries, uterus, thyroid, bone marrow, heart, eyes. If you look at this biodistribution study, you can see that over time, the concentration of the messenger RNA and the lipid nanoparticle increase in these critical areas. So now we have indisputable evidence of where the vaccine could go and what it could do once it got there. The answer was yes. Yes, the messenger RNA wrapped in a lipid nanoparticle delivery system crosses the blood-brain barrier and concentrates in the pituitary and spinal cord. When I raised my concerns to the director of the Defense Health Agency and forwarded her a copy of Pfizer's biodistribution study, the response was, it made no sense. In light of what we now know about the DoD's collaboration with Pfizer to conduct a phase 3 clinical research trial on DoD personnel, it is concerning that the very person who oversaw immunizations for the whole Defense Health Agency didn't recognize Pfizer's biodistribution study, nor the significance of the messenger RNA crossing the blood-brain barrier. Here's the second part. And note, the concentration in the ovaries is at almost 12 times more than anywhere else. The Defense Medical Epidemiology Database. In the absence of transparency and a functioning medical surveillance system, I believe the information and expertise I gained from having access to the uncensored C19 group, my firsthand experience monitoring the health of my brigade, and the data from the Defense Medical Epidemiology Database uniquely have equipped me with invaluable insight into the emerging deleterious effects of the COVID vaccine on aviation safety. As a brigade surgeon, I'm required to review the health of roughly 4,000 young 20 to 30-year-old pilots, aircrew members, and soldiers every month. I have to give an accounting to the commander on any pilot or aircrew member whose medical condition prevents them from participating in flight training. Biostatistical analysis of the past 3 years of these monthly health reviews shows alarming trends that started only after the introduction of the COVID-19 vaccination. These trends are more obvious because the population is specifically selected for aviation duties based on their superior level of health and fitness. In 15 years of taking care of soldiers, I have never seen the litany of debilitating and potentially deadly medical conditions that included strokes, transient ischemic attacks, pericarditis, myocarditis, erratic heart rates, arrhythmias, rapid onset and progression of various cancers, to include testicular cancer, esophageal cancer, brain tumors, neuroendocrine tumors, thyroid dysfunction, multiple sclerosis, cognitive impairment, persistent severe insomnia, suppression of the immune system, unprovoked clots in the splenic and portal vein, liver dysfunction, menstrual irregularities, and miscarriages. This cluster of medical conditions represented a dramatic shift in the acuity of medical conditions normally seen in this population. When I reached out to the Army Public Health Command and numerous senior medical leaders about my safety concerns, I was ignored. Threats against my career were made, but no appropriate actions were taken to fully investigate the number and the scope of adverse medical events after the vaccination. The DMED database is a database in which military healthcare professionals can perform queries to determine medical trends among active duty personnel using International Codes of Disease, ICD codes. An ICD code corresponds to specific diseases, injuries, or illness. Since the DoD uses one electronic medical record system worldwide, the DMED is arguably one of the most accurate epidemiology databases in the United States. For example, I could query how many times healthcare providers across the DoD had diagnosed an active duty service member with ICD I-26 pulmonary embolisms, going all the way back to 1991. As you can see, these are cases of diagnoses of pulmonary embolisms that healthcare providers in the military have made across the DoD in years 2016 through 2021. I was unable to get transparency from senior medical leaders on vaccine adverse events, so I began looking up ICD codes in the DMED that corresponded to rare medical conditions I was seeing in my population. The pathophysiologic basis for these medical conditions was, again, supported by the Pfizer's biodistribution study and further validated by their cumulative analysis of post-authorization adverse events. Is it a coincidence that the unusual medical conditions I was seeing in my soldiers were the very medical conditions Pfizer and the FDA had seen during clinical trials? Pfizer's report detailed 1,291 significant and debilitating adverse events after vaccination seen during the clinical trials. Here are some more of the DMED findings. You heard Rosie talk about her thyroid autoimmune disorder. Pregnancy with abortive outcome. Congenital malformations of babies. Cancer of the breast. When you took the DMED data and you overlaid various reports on service members, you see that the curves correlate perfectly. Here is 2 out of the 9 pages outlined in the 1,291 adverse events. All the conditions in blue are incompatible with safety of flight. All of the highlighted conditions in yellow are conditions I have personally seen. In the FDA's October 22, 2020 presentation regarding safety surveillance of COVID-19 vaccines proves the FDA was aware of these vaccines were dangerous and deadly. This list of devastating cardiovascular, neurologic, autoimmune, pregnancy, and reproductive complications should have been unacceptable not only in Army aviation, but also for military leaders across the DoD, physicians across the country, and regulatory agencies like the FDA. After finding catastrophic DMED data, I had Drs. Major Sam Sigaloff and Lieutenant Colonel Pete Chambers independently verify the data. Within hours of the DMED data being presented to Senator Johnson, Moderna lost $140 billion in stock. When the DMED data, I'll take that. When the DMED data was presented to the Aviation Center of Excellence Command General, Major General Francis, and he demanded an explanation for the data from the Defense Health Agency, the DHA took 47 days to formulate a response to data with devastating national security implications. 47 days to explain data, and how was this data a surprise to the very people responsible for monitoring it? The fact that the DHA had to be alerted to the data by me is at best an indictment of gross medical negligence and dereliction of duty in the medical surveillance of our force during the Super Bowl of pandemics, and at worst, an intentional act of medical treason. How could any military leader review the following data outlined from our own medical database and continue to order service members to take an experimental drug? At the very least, leaders should have reflexively stopped all vaccinations until a full investigation was completed. These questions demand investigations and answers. The intentional harm of U.S. citizens and service members is unacceptable. I requested and received a report from the CDC on the number and type of vaccine adverse events made on service members. There are 9,953 reports, 10% of which are deadly, debilitating, or required hospitalization. There were 119 deaths after vaccination of our service men and women in 1 year, when there was 93 deaths of service members from all branches and components across the DoD attributed to the COVID infection in 2 years. Over the last 2 years, military medical professionals have received numerous emails on a daily and weekly basis regarding everything COVID. What was missing was equal vigilance and fervor for risk communication on emerging adverse medical events and complications after COVID vaccines were mandated. The CARES Act financially incentivized everything COVID except vaccine safety reporting. Medical professionals are required by law to file VAERS reports for monitoring vaccines safety that result in billions of dollars of profit for Big Pharma. But why, when our regulatory agencies are ignoring these safety signals? Recently, the CDC director admitted that the agency gave false information on COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring. The very agencies Americans trusted to monitor the safety of this experimental vaccine admitted to being sound asleep at the wheel, while whistleblower doctors across the country who dared to raise concerns were demonized, censored, silenced, reprimanded, and retaliated against. But what about the DoD? Surely professionals tasked with the health surveillance of our fighting force would be vigilant in monitoring signals of harm from this drug. Unlike VAERS reports made by civilians, VAERS reports on service members were easily verified using the single electronic medical record system the DoD uses. VAERS reports on service members presented the single most accurate and verifiable accounts of post-vaccination injury in the United States. Yet to date, military medical professionals across the DoD have never received any communication to indicate any such active medical surveillance has taken place. In fact, I am concerned that executives at Pfizer Pharmaceutical have superior transparency on the number, frequency, and severity of these post-vaccination events than military personnel who have a non-financial fiduciary duty to the health of our force. Stop and think about it. The strategic compromise of our national defense that has occurred by surrendering unlimited power to a for-profit corporation, like the pharmaceutical companies and corrupt regulatory agencies like the NIH, CDC, and FDA. Members of Congress and the Senate must immediately demand the DoD present their investigation and summary findings of all VAERS reports on service members. The impact of relentless coercion, intimidation, threats, abuse of authority, blatant disregard for bodily autonomy and religious freedom has directly resulted in devastation to medical readiness in the form of failed recruiting, retention, mass resignation, forced separations of personnel that hold critical military occupational specialties, in addition to the attrition from vaccine-induced medical injury. Despite the totality of this devastation to our force, senior leaders and officials at the highest levels will not pivot from this self-inflicted castration of our national defense. Evidence for SARS-CoV-2 and COVID vaccinations as bioweapons. When I trained at Fort Detrick in the medical management of chemical and biological casualties, we were trained that the one thing that prevented adversaries from deploying bioweapons was that in order for them to have a strategic impact, our enemies would have to have a delivery mechanism that would allow them to expose a large enough population of people in a short period of time before people knew they were being attacked. For example, dispersion in the air would be cumbersome and ineffective given UV light, dispersion, wind patterns, and that there are generally not significantly large enough numbers of people outside concentrated in small areas. Likewise, attempting to put them in water would have limited effectiveness because of dilution, degradation from chloride, etc. But what if hundreds of millions of people would willingly allow themselves to be injected with a bioweapon? What if global mass vaccination could be accomplished in a short period of time by applying relentless coercion tactics and psychological operations to demoralize people into submission? I am compelled to inform you that after reviewing all the available evidence, I have concluded that the NIH gain-of-function research led to the development of a more lethal, more transmissible coronavirus, and that the same stakeholders involved in the development of this bioweapon leveraged the global terror and fear that this bioweapon produced to advance a political narrative that would ultimately decimate individual rights and bodily autonomy by making Americans submit to injection that makes every recipient's body manufacture the gain-of-function bioweapon spike protein. Again, it is my professional medical opinion that a bioweapon was produced through gain-of-function technology. Then, messenger RNA delivery system through mandatory vaccinations was used to strategically deliver the bioweapon into the body of millions, upon millions of Americans and people around the world. Which of our enemies would not want to get a handful of key people in authority to mandate the injection of our entire fighting force with a drug that could compromise the short and long-term health of our force and thereby disable our national defense? Time has proven Time has now proven that not only does this experimental drug not protect individuals against infection or prevent transmission, but it also poses an unacceptable level of risk and harm to patients. So why do senior military leaders committed to the health and readiness of our military continue to implement policies that will purge hundreds of thousands of service members out of the armed forces for refusing to consent to being injected with an ineffective and dangerous drug? Is it possible that the $97 million a day the pharmaceutical companies are making is compromising our military? Under the guise of medical readiness, top leaders demanded execution of unlawful orders for service members to get vaccinated with a fully FDA-approved vaccine, all the while knowing that not a single vial of the FDA-approved vaccine existed in the United States. So the law was subverted by convincing commanders that the EUA and fully FDA-approved products were interchangeable. Interchangeable. Tell that to my 24-year-old pilot with permanent cardiac heart damage, who has no legal recourse for financial restitution from the same pharmaceutical companies making record-breaking profits off the product that destroyed his future. The concept of interchangeability was a fraud perpetrated on service members. Are DoD policies protecting service members, or are they only serving to protect the financial interests of the pharmaceutical companies, which the DoD has partnered with to ensure Big Pharma had a large enough captive patient population necessary to attain their EUA and FDA vaccine approval? There is a level of product safety that only comes when mega corporations like pharmaceutical companies can be held financially and legally accountable for the harm their products cause. Doctors, politicians, employers, military leaders, scientists, fellow Americans, if you have been on the wrong side of this, take the courageous action, humble yourselves, Pivot with a repentant heart and stop terrorizing your fellow Americans. To those of you who have perpetrated this global crime against humanity, I say to you, woe. Woe to you workers of iniquity, for all you have done in darkness is and will be brought to light. Americans, will you sleep soundly in your beds, warmed by the fires of your republic burning around you? Will you bend your knee to tyranny today and offer up the arms of your children to evil tomorrow? Let our children never say we were cowards in the face of evil. Seek wisdom, pursue truth, and put your trust in the Lord. Hold the line.